There's nothing quite like watching your world crumble in a single moment. Marcus Rivera stood in the unemployment office, clutching termination papers that felt heavier than the winter coat he couldn't afford to replace. 6 months of job searching had led to nothing but rejection emails and dwindling hope. His wife Elena had been gone for 3 years now, taken by cancer that had drained their savings faster than the treatments could drain her strength. Now it was just Marcus and his 8-year-old daughter Sofia, living in a cramped apartment above the laundromat where the heat barely worked, and the walls were thin enough to hear every argument from their neighbors. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The social worker's words echoed in his mind as he walked home through the December snow. Mr. Rivera, without stable employment, we have concerns about Sofia's living situation. The court date is set for January 15th. 3 weeks to find a miracle, or lose the only light left in his life. His daughter, with her mother's bright eyes and unshakable faith that everything would work out, had no idea how close they were to losing each other. Marcus had been a construction foreman for 12 years before the accident. One slip on an icy beam, one broken vertebra, and suddenly he was too much of an insurance liability for the company that had once praised his leadership. The workers' compensation had run out months ago, and the pain in his back served as a constant reminder that his body could no longer handle the physical demands of the only work he'd ever known. At 42, he felt ancient and obsolete, watching younger men take the few construction jobs available, while he struggled to retrain for work that seemed to require skills he'd never developed. But today brought something different. Today brought the Thornfield River and 2 small voices crying for help. Marcus had taken Sofia to Riverside Park that Saturday morning, one of the few free activities they could still afford. The park bordered the Thornfield River, which had been unusually swollen from the recent December thaw, followed by a sudden freeze that left patches of treacherous ice floating on the dark water. Most sensible people stayed away from the riverbank during winter, but the park's playground was far enough from the water to be safe, and Sofia loved the old wooden swings that reminded her of happier times. "Daddy, push me higher!" Sofia called out, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. Marcus smiled, despite his worries, grateful for these moments when his daughter could still be a child, unburdened by their financial struggles and uncertain future. He gave her swing another gentle push, watching her dark hair stream behind her as she soared through the crisp morning air. The park was nearly empty, just a few joggers on the distant path and an elderly man walking his dog near the parking area. Marcus appreciated the solitude. It meant Sofia wouldn't see other children with new winter coats and expensive toys, wouldn't ask questions about why they couldn't afford the things other families took for granted. Here, in this moment, they could pretend their world was still intact. That's when they heard the screaming. The sound cut through the winter air like broken glass, high-pitched and desperate. Marcus stopped pushing Sofia's swing, every parental instinct in his body suddenly alert. The screaming was coming from the direction of the river, and it sounded like children in distress. "Stay right here, Mija," Marcus told Sofia, his voice urgent but controlled. "Don't move from this swing, understand?" "Daddy, what's wrong?" "Just stay here. I'll be right back." Marcus ran toward the sound, his boots slipping on the frost-covered grass as he rushed toward the riverbank. What he saw there made his blood turn to ice water. 2 boys, probably around 10 years old, had somehow ended up in the river. One was clinging desperately to a chunk of ice that looked ready to break apart, while the other was being swept downstream by the current, his small hands grasping frantically at ice chunks that crumbled under his weight. "Help us!" the first boy screamed, his voice already growing hoarse from the cold. "Please, somebody help us!" Marcus didn't hesitate. He'd grown up near water, had been a strong swimmer before his injury, and he understood that in situations like this, seconds mattered more than safety protocols. The boys were maybe 50 feet from shore, but the current was carrying them further away with each passing moment. He yanked off his heavy winter jacket and boots, knowing they would only drag him down in the icy water. The shock of the river was like being struck by lightning. Every nerve in his body screamed in protest as he dove in and began swimming toward the boys with strong, desperate strokes. The cold was beyond anything Marcus had ever experienced. It felt like his lungs were being crushed, like his heart might simply stop from the shock. But he could see the terror in the boys' faces, could hear their weakening cries, and he forced himself to keep moving through water that felt thick as concrete. He reached the first boy, just as the chunk of ice he was clinging to finally gave way. The child went under, and Marcus dove after him, his hands searching through the murky water until he found a small arm and pulled the boy back to the surface. The child was semi-conscious, his lips already turning blue, but he was breathing. "Hold on to my shoulders," Marcus gasped, treading water while supporting the boy's weight. "Don't let go." The second boy was further downstream, being carried toward a section of the river where fallen trees created a dangerous tangle of branches just below the surface. Marcus began swimming in that direction, fighting the current while the first boy clung to his back, both of them losing body heat with each passing second. By the time Marcus reached the second child, the boy had gone under twice and was barely conscious. Marcus grabbed him around the chest and began the desperate swim back toward shore, now supporting two children while his own strength ebbed away in the freezing water. The swim back to shore felt like it took hours, though it couldn't have been more than 5 minutes. Marcus's muscles were cramping from the cold, his vision was starting to blur, and he could feel the hypothermia setting in, but he kept swimming, driven by the same paternal instinct that had carried him through 2 years of caring for Elena during her illness, the same determination that had kept him searching for work even when every door seemed closed. When his feet finally touched the rocky riverbank, Marcus used the last of his strength to push both boys up onto dry land before collapsing beside them. All 3 of them were shivering violently, the boys barely conscious, and Marcus feeling like his body was shutting down from the cold. That's when he heard the sound of expensive car doors slamming and urgent voices shouting commands. Through his blurred vision, Marcus saw several men in dark suits running toward them, along with a tall man in a camel hair coat who looked like he'd stepped out of a boardroom rather than a Riverside emergency. "Get the paramedics over here now," the tall man was shouting into a phone. "And call Dr. Harrison. Tell him to meet us at Presbyterian Hospital immediately." The man knelt beside the 2 boys, his face a mask of terror and relief. "Tommy, Jake, can you hear me?" "It's Dad. You're gonna be okay." Marcus tried to sit up, but his body wasn't responding properly. One of the suited men was already wrapping him in an emergency blanket that had appeared from somewhere, while paramedics worked on the 2 boys with professional efficiency. "Sir, what's your name?" a paramedic asked Marcus, checking his pulse while another medic started an IV line. "Marcus Rivera," he managed through chattering teeth. "My daughter. She's at the playground. Need to?" "We'll take care of your daughter," the tall man said, kneeling beside Marcus's stretcher as the paramedics prepared to load him into an ambulance. "I'm Richard." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Thornfield. "Those are my sons you just saved, Tommy and Jake." Even through his hypothermic confusion, Marcus recognized the name. Richard Thornfield was one of the wealthiest men in the state, the CEO of Thornfield Industries, whose corporate headquarters dominated the city skyline. His face had been on magazine covers and business news programs for years. "My daughter," Marcus tried again, "is already being taken care of," Thornfield assured him. "One of my security team is with her, and she'll be brought to the hospital to see you as soon as the doctors clear you." As the ambulance pulled away from Riverside Park, Marcus caught a glimpse of Sofia being gently led toward a black sedan by a woman in a professional suit, his little girl looking scared but unharmed. Relief flooded through him just before the medical sedatives took effect, and the world faded to black. Marcus woke up 18 hours later in a private hospital room that was nicer than any hotel he'd ever seen. The walls were painted in warm colors, the furniture looked expensive, and there were flowers everywhere. Sofia was asleep in a chair beside his bed, wrapped in what looked like a brand new winter coat that probably cost more than Marcus made in a month. "Daddy!" Sofia's eyes opened the moment Marcus stirred. "You're awake! The doctors said you were going to be okay, but you were sleeping for so long, and I was scared." "I'm okay, Misha," Marcus said, his voice still hoarse. "How did you get here? Who brought you?" "A nice lady named Mrs. Patterson. She said she works for Mr. Thornfield, and that Mr. Thornfield is the daddy of the boys you saved. She bought me this coat, and took me to get hamburgers, and then she brought me here to wait for you to wake up." Before Marcus could process this information fully, there was a soft knock on the door. Richard Thornfield entered, looking less polished than he had at the Riverside, but somehow more human. He was followed by two boys who Marcus recognized, despite having seen them only briefly in the traumatic circumstances of the rescue. "Mr. Rivera," Thornfield said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how to begin to thank you." The two boys, Tommy and Jake, stepped forward shyly. They looked healthy and unharmed, though Marcus could see the lingering traces of their ordeal in their eyes. "We wanted to thank you for saving us," Tommy said, the older of the two by what looked like maybe a year. "Dad said you jumped in the river even though it was really cold and dangerous." "We're sorry we fell in," Jake added. "We were trying to get our remote control boat that got stuck on the ice. And then the ice broke." Marcus looked at these two boys, probably not much older than Sofia, and felt his heart clench with the recognition of how close they'd all come to tragedy. "I'm just glad you're both safe," he said simply. Thornfield pulled up a chair beside the bed, his expensive suit looking out of place in the hospital setting, but his expression completely sincere. "Mr. Rivera, I've learned a lot about you in the past day. I know about your situation. Your job loss, your wife's illness, the custody hearing you're facing." Marcus felt his face flush with embarrassment. The last thing he wanted was pity from a billionaire who probably couldn't understand what it meant to choose between heating bills and groceries. "I'm not looking for charity," Marcus said quietly. "I'm not offering charity," Thornfield replied. "I'm offering something much more valuable in opportunity. But first, I need to tell you something about why my sons were at that park yesterday. Something that's going to sound incredible, but that I need you to understand." Thornfield looked at his sons, who nodded as if they'd already discussed whatever revelation was coming. Tommy and Jake weren't supposed to be at Riverside Park yesterday. Their bodyguard had explicit instructions to take them to the country club for their sailing lesson. But they convinced him to stop at the park first, said they wanted to try out their new remote control boat on the river. "The boat was a Christmas present," Jake explained. "We'd only used it once, in the pool at home, and we wanted to see how it worked in real water." "The thing is," Thornfield continued, "my sons have never shown any interest in that park before. They've never asked to go there, never even mentioned it. But yesterday morning they were absolutely insistent. Jake actually threw a tantrum when the bodyguard initially refused." Marcus didn't understand where this was going, but something in Thornfield's tone suggested there was more to the story. "Mr. Rivera, what I'm about to tell you is going to sound impossible, but I've spent my entire career dealing with probabilities and calculated risks. What happened yesterday wasn't coincidence." Thornfield pulled out a tablet and showed Marcus what appeared to be surveillance footage from various cameras around the city. "This is from the traffic camera at 5th and Main, taken at 9:47 yesterday morning. That's you and Sofia walking toward the park. The footage clearly showed Marcus and Sofia making their way through the snowy streets, Sofia skipping beside her father despite their worn winter clothes and obvious financial struggles. This is from the park security camera at 9:52, 5 minutes later. The next video showed Marcus pushing Sofia on the swings, both of them laughing despite their circumstances. And this," Thornfield said, advancing to another video, "is from the same camera at 9:58, my sons arriving at the park with their bodyguard." Marcus watched as a black sedan pulled into the parking area, and the two boys jumped out, carrying what looked like an expensive remote control boat. "Here's what doesn't make sense," Thornfield said, his voice growing more intense. "My sons left our house at 9:15 yesterday morning. The country club where they were supposed to go is 12 minutes from our house. The park is 23 minutes from our house, in the opposite direction from the club." Marcus was beginning to understand the implication, but it seemed too strange to believe. If they had gone directly to the country club as planned, they would have arrived at 9:27. Instead, they insisted on this detour to a park they'd never visited before, arriving at exactly 9:58. 6 minutes before they fell through the ice. 10 minutes before you heard their screams and jumped in to save them. Thornfield leaned forward, his eyes locked on Marcus's. "Mr. Rivera, if my sons had followed their original plan, if they had gone directly to their sailing lesson, they would have been safely at the country club when you and Sofia arrived at the park. There would have been no emergency, no rescue, No reason for our paths to cross. But they didn't follow the plan, Marcus said slowly. No, they didn't. And when I asked them why they were so insistent on going to that specific park, they gave me an answer that's been keeping me awake since yesterday. Tommy stepped closer to his father's chair. We had the same dream, he said simply. For 3 nights before yesterday, we both had the same dream about the park and the river. In the dream, Jake continued, we were in the water and we were really scared, and then a man with kind eyes jumped in to save us. A man who looked exactly like Mr. Rivera. Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with his recent hypothermia. You dreamed about me before you met me? We dreamed about you saving us, Tommy said. And in the dream, you had a little girl with you, a girl with dark hair who was waiting for you to come back. Sofia, who had been listening to this conversation with wide eyes, spoke up for the first time. I had strange dreams too, she said quietly. For the past week, I kept dreaming about Daddy swimming in cold water, and I was always scared he wouldn't come back. The hospital room fell silent as the implications of what they were discussing sank in. Marcus was a practical man, someone who dealt in concrete problems and tangible solutions. But he couldn't deny what he was hearing, couldn't explain away the precise timing and the impossible coincidences that had brought them all together. Mr. Rivera, Thornfield said, I've built my career on analyzing patterns and identifying opportunities that others miss. What happened yesterday wasn't random. It was orchestrated by forces we don't understand, for purposes we're only beginning to glimpse. What are you saying? I'm saying that you didn't just save my sons' lives. You were chosen to save their lives. And I believe that rescue was just the beginning of something much larger. Marcus looked around the hospital room, at his daughter in her expensive new coat, at the 2 boys whose lives he'd risked everything to save, at the billionaire CEO who was talking about dreams and destiny as if they were quarterly earnings reports. Mr. Thornfield, I appreciate everything you've done for Sofia and me, but I'm not sure I understand what you're suggesting. Thornfield stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city skyline where his corporate headquarters rose like a steel and glass monument to his success. Mr. Rivera, I've spent 15 years building Thornfield Industries into one of the most successful companies in the country. We employ over 40,000 people, generate billions in revenue, and I have more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes. He turned back to face Marcus, and for the first time Marcus could see vulnerability in the powerful man's expression. But until yesterday, I was failing at the most important job I'll ever have. I was failing as a father. Thornfield sat back down, his shoulders sagging slightly. Tommy and Jake are 10 years old, and they barely know me. I've been so focused on building my business empire that I've missed most of their childhood. Their mother died when they were 6, and since then, they've been raised by nannies and tutors and private school teachers while I traveled the world making deals. Yesterday, when I saw them in that river, when I realized how close I came to losing them forever, I understood something that no amount of success or money can replace. I understood that none of my achievements matter if I can't protect the people I love. Marcus was beginning to see where this conversation was heading, but the magnitude of what Thornfield seemed to be suggesting was almost impossible to process. Mr. Rivera, you risked your life to save my children without hesitation, without knowing who they were or expecting any reward. You jumped into that freezing water because it was the right thing to do, because you understood something that I've forgotten in my pursuit of wealth and power. Thornfield reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card, but instead of handing it to Marcus, he set it on the bedside table. I want to offer you a position with Thornfield Industries. Not charity, not a token job to ease my conscience, but a real opportunity to help me transform how my company operates. I need someone who understands what really matters. Someone who can help me build something that serves people instead of just generating profits. Marcus picked up the business card. It was elegant and simple, with Thornfield Industries logo embossed in gold, but written on the back in Thornfield's handwriting were the words, Director of Community Development, $150,000 annually. I don't understand, Marcus said. I don't have experience in corporate development. I'm a construction foreman who lost his job because of a back injury. You have something more valuable than experience, Thornfield replied. You have perspective. You understand what it means to struggle, to worry about providing for your family, to face impossible choices between basic necessities. Most of my executives have never experienced genuine hardship, have never had to choose between paying rent and buying medicine. Thornfield gestured toward his sons, who were listening to every word with the serious attention that children reserve for conversations they know will change their lives. I want to restructure Thornfield Industries, to focus on projects that actually improve people's lives. Affordable housing, accessible healthcare, educational opportunities for kids who can't afford private schools. But I can't do that effectively with advisors who've never lived paycheck to paycheck. You want me to help you spend your money differently, Marcus said, still trying to process the offer. I want you to help me understand how to use my company's resources to address the problems you've been facing. Housing insecurity, healthcare access, employment opportunities for people whose careers have been disrupted by injury or illness. Marcus looked at Sofia, who was listening with the bright attention she gave to all adult conversations she found interesting. His daughter had always been wise beyond her years, forced to mature quickly by their circumstances, and he could see her processing the implications of what Thornfield was offering. "Daddy," Sofia said quietly, "does this mean we won't have to move away from our apartment?" The question hit Marcus like a physical blow. Sofia knew about the custody hearing, knew they were facing the possibility of separation, but she'd been trying to protect him from her own fears, just as he'd been trying to protect her from their financial desperation. "Misha, if I take this job, it means we'll be able to afford a better place to live. Maybe even a house with a backyard where you can play." Sofia's eyes lit up with an excitement that Marcus hadn't seen since before Elena's illness. "And I can stay with you? I don't have to go live with the foster family?" "You'll never have to leave me," Marcus promised, feeling tears he'd been holding back for months finally beginning to fall. Thornfield cleared his throat, clearly moved by the exchange between father and daughter. "Mr. Rivera, there's one more thing I need to tell you. Something about the timing of yesterday's events that I think you need to understand." Marcus wiped his eyes and turned his attention back to the billionaire CEO who was offering to transform his life. "The custody hearing you're facing is scheduled for January 15th, 3 weeks from yesterday. I've done some research, and based on your current financial situation, the likelihood of a favorable outcome was essentially zero." The blunt assessment stung, but Marcus couldn't deny its accuracy. However, Thornfield continued, "If you accept this position, you'll have stable employment, health insurance, and a salary that demonstrates your ability to provide for Sofia. More importantly, you'll have the resources to hire competent legal representation. You would do all of that because I pulled your sons out of the river? Mr. Rivera, you didn't just pull my sons out of the river. You reminded me what it means to put someone else's welfare before your own safety. You showed me the kind of man I want to be, the kind of father my sons deserve." Thornfield stood up and walked back to the window, his voice growing more determined. "I've spent years accumulating wealth and power, but yesterday I learned that neither of those things matter if you're not using them to protect and serve the people you care about. Tommy and Jake are going to grow up watching how I respond to this situation. They're going to learn from my example whether success means accumulating resources for yourself or using those resources to help others." Marcus looked at the business card in his hands, at the salary figure that represented more money than he'd ever dreamed of earning, at the opportunity to transform not just his own life but potentially the lives of countless others. "What would my job actually involve?" Marcus asked. "You would work directly with me to identify and develop programs that address real community needs. We'd start by researching the problems you've experienced firsthand: lack of affordable healthcare, limited job retraining opportunities, inadequate support for single parents facing economic hardship." Thornfield returned to his chair, his expression growing more animated as he outlined his vision. "Then we'd use Thornfield Industries resources to create solutions. Maybe that means partnering with hospitals to provide sliding-scale medical care. Maybe it means developing job training programs for workers who've been injured or displaced. Maybe it means building affordable housing that doesn't warehouse families in dangerous or degrading conditions." "You're talking about changing how your entire company operates," Marcus said. "I'm talking about changing what success means," Thornfield replied. "For too long, I've measured my achievements by stock prices and profit margins. But yesterday, when I thought I was going to lose my sons, I realized that none of that matters if you're not using your success to make life better for the people around you." Marcus thought about all the nights he'd lain awake wondering how he was going to provide for Sofia, all the job applications that had been rejected, all the bills he'd been unable to pay. The opportunity Thornfield was offering wasn't just employment. It was the chance to transform their circumstances completely. But more than that, it was the opportunity to help ensure that other families wouldn't face the same desperate choices he'd been confronting. "If I take this job," Marcus said slowly, "I want to make sure I can actually help people, not just serve as a token representative to make your company look more socially conscious." "That's exactly why I need you," Thornfield said. "Anyone can hire consultants to develop corporate social responsibility programs that look good in annual reports. I need someone who will hold me accountable to actually improving people's lives, someone who won't let me get away with superficial gestures." Tommy stepped forward, looking at Marcus with the earnest expression that children use when they're trying to communicate something important to adults. "Mr. Rivera, will you help our dad learn how to help people the way you helped us?" The question was simple, but it carried the weight of everything that had happened since Marcus first heard the boys' screams from the riverbank. This wasn't just about a job offer or financial security. It was about the responsibility that came with being chosen for something larger than himself. Marcus looked at Sofia, who was watching him with complete trust, confident that her father would make the right decision. He thought about Elena, who had always believed that their struggles would eventually lead to something meaningful, that their hardships were preparing them to help others facing similar challenges. "Mr. Thornfield," Marcus said, "I accept your offer, but I have some conditions." "Name them." "First, I want regular access to you personally, not just meetings with your staff. If I'm going to help you understand community needs, you need to be willing to see those communities firsthand." "Agreed." "Second, I want transparency about how decisions get made and implemented. I don't want to develop programs that look good on paper but never actually help anyone." "Absolutely." "Third, I want Sofia to be part of this process. She's lived through everything I've experienced, and kids often understand things that adults miss. I want her perspective included in our planning." Thornfield smiled, the first genuinely relaxed expression Marcus had seen from him. "Mr. Rivera, I think you're going to be exactly what Thornfield Industries needs." As Marcus shook hands with the man whose sons he'd saved, he felt something shifting in his chest. For the first time in months, he could imagine a future that held possibility instead of just survival. The river that had nearly claimed 3 lives had instead brought together people who needed each other in ways they were only beginning to understand. But Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that yesterday's rescue was just the beginning of something much larger. The dreams that had brought Tommy and Jake to the park, the precise timing that had put him in position to save them, the opportunity that was now transforming his family's entire future, all of it suggested patterns that extended beyond simple coincidence. Outside the hospital window, the Thornfield River continued its steady flow toward the sea, carrying with it the memory of yesterday's crisis and the promise of whatever revelations tomorrow might bring. Marcus didn't yet understand the full significance of what had begun with 2 boys' cries for help, but he was beginning to suspect that saving their lives had been only the first step in a journey that would challenge everything he thought he knew about fate, responsibility, and the mysterious forces that sometimes bring the right people together at exactly the right moment. The business card in his pocket felt like a key to a door he'd never imagined existed, and as he looked at his daughter's excited face and the grateful expressions of Tommy and Jake, Marcus realized that sometimes the most important rescues happen after you've already pulled someone from the water. 3 weeks later, Marcus stood in the gleaming lobby of Thornfield Industries headquarters, feeling like an imposter in his new suit. The building stretched 47 floors into the Seattle sky, its glass and steel facade reflecting the winter clouds that had been his constant companion since the river rescue. Sofia gripped his hand tightly, her eyes wide as she took in the marble floors, the abstract sculptures, and the steady stream of executives moving with purposeful urgency toward elevators that whisked them to floors Marcus couldn't even imagine. "It's like a castle, Daddy," Sofia whispered, her voice echoing slightly in the vast space. "But for business people instead of kings." Marcus squeezed her hand, drawing comfort from her presence as much as he hoped to provide it. The custody hearing had been postponed pending a review of his new employment situation, but the social worker's skeptical expression still haunted his dreams. Stable job or not, Marcus knew he was being watched carefully, his every decision scrutinized for evidence that he could provide the kind of life Sofia deserved. The elevator ride to the 39th floor passed in silence, Marcus watching the city shrink below them as they rose toward Thornfield's executive offices. When the doors opened, they were greeted by a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a professional demeanor that somehow managed to be both efficient and welcoming. "Mr. Rivera, I'm Catherine Walsh, Mr. Thornfield's executive assistant. He's waiting for you in the conference room, along with some people he'd like you to meet." She smiled down at Sofia. "And you must be the famous Sofia I've heard so much about. Mr. Thornfield asked me to prepare a special workspace for you if you'd like to see it." Sofia looked up at Marcus for permission, then followed Catherine down a hallway lined with awards and photographs documenting Thornfield Industries' corporate history. Marcus found himself studying the images, trying to understand the company he was now part of. There were ribbon-cutting ceremonies for new facilities, handshake deals with government officials, and glossy portraits of the executive team. But something felt sterile about the displays, as if they documented success without capturing any sense of purpose or human connection. The conference room was as impressive as everything else in the building, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of Elliott Bay and the Olympic Mountains beyond. Richard Thornfield sat at the head of a polished table that could have seated 20 people, flanked by 3 individuals who looked like they'd stepped out of a business magazine. "Marcus, thank you for coming," Thornfield said, rising to shake hands with genuine warmth. "I'd like you to meet some key members of our leadership team." The introductions followed quickly. Janet Morrison, Chief Financial Officer, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who assessed Marcus with the calculating gaze of someone accustomed to evaluating risk. David Chen, Director of Operations, whose firm handshake and direct manner suggested military background. And Dr. Sarah Hendricks, Head of Research and Development, whose enthusiastic smile hinted at the kind of intellectual curiosity that thrived on solving complex problems. "We've been discussing your role within the organization," Morrison said once they were all seated. "Mr. Thornfield has outlined some ambitious goals for community development initiatives, but we need to understand the practical implications for our operational budget and strategic planning." Marcus sensed tension beneath the polite corporate language. These were people who had built their careers on measurable outcomes and predictable processes, and his presence represented something that didn't fit their established frameworks. "I appreciate your concerns," Marcus said carefully. "I'm not here to disrupt successful operations, but to help identify opportunities where Thornfield Industries can create positive community impact while maintaining financial viability." Chen leaned forward, his expression skeptical. "Mr. Rivera, community development sounds admirable in theory, but we operate in competitive markets where profit margins determine our ability to employ thousands of people. How do we balance social responsibility with shareholder obligations?" Before Marcus could respond, Thornfield interrupted with an edge in his voice that Marcus hadn't heard before. "David, our shareholders include pension funds that support teachers and firefighters, investment accounts that fund college educations and retirement plans. Our responsibility to them includes ensuring that Thornfield Industries contributes to communities where those people live and work." Dr. Hendricks spoke up with the measured tone of someone accustomed to mediating between competing perspectives. "Perhaps we could start by identifying specific community needs that align with our existing capabilities. Our construction division already builds commercial and residential projects. Could we adapt those processes to address affordable housing shortages?" Marcus felt the conversation shifting toward practical possibilities, and he seized the opening. "Dr. Hendricks, that's exactly the kind of thinking that could make a real difference. But before we develop solutions, we need to understand the problems from the perspective of people who are actually living them." He pulled out a folder he'd prepared, containing photographs and documentation from his months of unemployment and housing insecurity. "This is what I learned during the past year about the barriers that prevent working families from accessing stable housing." Marcus spread the documents across the conference table, revealing a side of the city that existed just miles from Thornfield's luxury headquarters but might as well have been on another planet. Photos of apartment buildings where heating systems failed regularly, leaving families to choose between rent money and utility bills. Rental applications that required deposits and fees totaling thousands of dollars up front, effectively excluding anyone who lived paycheck to paycheck. Documentation of landlords who refused to rent to single parents or families with children, despite fair housing laws that theoretically prohibited such discrimination. "This is the apartment where Sofia and I have been living," Marcus said, pointing to a photograph of their cramped unit above the laundromat. "Rent is $800 a month for one bedroom, with utilities that run another $200. The heat works sporadically. The plumbing backs up regularly, and the walls are thin enough that we can hear every conversation from neighboring units." Morrison studied the documents with the focused attention she usually reserved for financial reports. "These conditions are unacceptable, but I don't understand how our company can address systemic housing problems." "We can't solve everything," Marcus acknowledged, "but we can demonstrate that profitable development doesn't have to mean luxury housing that working families can't afford." What if Thornfield Construction developed mixed-income communities where teachers and nurses and mechanics could afford to live near their jobs? Chen shook his head. Mixed-income housing typically requires subsidies or tax incentives that reduce profit margins. Our investors expect returns comparable to market-rate developments. "What if the returns came from different sources?" Marcus asked. "Lower turnover rates. Reduced maintenance costs from tenants who have genuine investment in their community. Partnerships with local employers who benefit from workforce housing." Thornfield had been listening to the exchange with growing intensity, and now he leaned back in his chair with the expression of someone processing new information. "Marcus, are you suggesting that community-focused development could actually be more profitable than traditional luxury projects?" "I'm suggesting that profitability depends on how you calculate costs and benefits," Marcus replied. "If you factor in the social costs of housing instability, workforce turnover, emergency service calls, educational disruption for children, the true cost of luxury-only development is much higher than it appears on quarterly reports." Dr. Hendricks was taking notes rapidly, her scientific mind clearly engaged by the analytical possibilities. "This is fascinating. We could develop metrics for measuring community impact alongside financial performance. Long-term studies of education outcomes, health indicators, economic mobility." "That's exactly what I'm talking about," Marcus said, feeling the energy in the room shift from skepticism toward genuine interest. "But the research needs to be grounded in real experience, not just academic theory." Morrison tapped her pen against her notepad, her expression thoughtful rather than dismissive. "Mr. Rivera, what would community-focused development look like in practical terms? Specific examples, not general concepts." Marcus had been hoping for this question. "Start with a pilot project. Identify a neighborhood that's experiencing gentrification pressure, where working families are being displaced by rising housing costs. Partner with local employers, hospitals, schools, service businesses to develop workforce housing that meets their employees' needs." "Go on," Thornfield prompted. "Design the development around community needs instead of maximum density. Include affordable retail space for local businesses, accessible childcare facilities, common areas where neighbors can build relationships. Price the units based on local wages, not regional luxury markets." Chen frowned. "And the profit model? Long-term stability instead of quick returns, lower vacancy rates, reduced marketing costs, partnerships with employers who help with down payment assistance or rental guarantees, plus positive community impact that enhances Thornfield Industries' reputation and attracts talented employees who want to work for socially responsible companies." The room fell silent as the executives processed Marcus's proposal. Through the conference room windows, Marcus could see the city spreading out below them, neighborhoods where families like his struggled with housing costs, while developers built luxury towers that stood half empty because working people couldn't afford to live in them. Thornfield stood up and walked to the windows, his hands clasped behind his back as he studied the view. "Marcus, I want you to develop a detailed proposal for this pilot project. Budget projections, timeline, partnership possibilities. We'll present it to the board of directors next month." Morrison looked alarmed. "Richard, we can't commit to experimental housing projects without extensive market analysis and risk assessment." "Janet, we've been doing market analysis and risk assessment for 15 years. We've built successful projects and generated substantial profits. But we've never tried to build anything that actually serves the community where our employees live." Thornfield turned back to face the group, his expression determined. "Tommy and Jake are going to inherit whatever kind of world we create. I want them to inherit communities where their neighbors aren't struggling to afford basic shelter, where success means everyone rises together instead of a few people accumulating wealth while others get displaced." Dr. Hendricks was nodding enthusiastically. Richard, this could position Thornfield Industries as a leader in sustainable development. The research applications alone could generate significant academic partnerships and grant opportunities. Chen remained skeptical but seemed to be considering the operational challenges rather than dismissing the concept entirely. We'd need to establish new vendor relationships, modify our standard construction processes, develop different marketing approaches. All of which creates opportunities for innovation and competitive advantage, Marcus pointed out. How many other major developers are focusing on workforce housing? We could establish market leadership in a segment that's being ignored by most of our competitors. The discussion continued for another hour, ranging across topics from zoning regulations to construction materials to financing mechanisms. Marcus found himself energized by the collaborative problem-solving, the sense that they were working toward solutions rather than simply managing existing systems. When the meeting finally concluded, Thornfield asked Marcus to stay behind for a private conversation. Morrison, Chen, and Dr. Hendricks gathered their materials and left, their body language suggesting a mixture of excitement and apprehension about the directions the company might be taking. "Marcus, how do you feel about your first leadership team meeting?" Thornfield asked, once they were alone. "Honestly, it's intimidating. These are smart people with decades of experience, and I'm still learning the language of corporate development. But you held your own. You presented ideas they hadn't considered, challenged assumptions they've been making for years." Thornfield sat down across from Marcus, his expression serious. "I need to tell you something about why I'm pushing this community development initiative so aggressively." Marcus waited, sensing that whatever Thornfield was about to share would be significant. 3 days after you saved Tommy and Jake, I received a phone call that changed my perspective on everything we've been discussing. Thornfield pulled out his phone and scrolled through his call history. Dr. Elizabeth Manning, professor of urban sociology at the University of Washington. She'd been following our company's development projects for her research on gentrification and displacement. Thornfield handed Marcus a business card with Dr. Manning's contact information. She wanted to meet with me about the community impact of our recent residential developments. Specifically, about families who had been forced to relocate because our luxury housing projects increased property values beyond what long-term residents could afford. Marcus felt a chill of recognition. He'd experienced exactly that kind of displacement pressure, watching his neighborhood change as new developments attracted higher-income residents and drove up costs for everyone else. Dr. Manning showed me data about educational disruption for children whose families are displaced by gentrification, kids who lose access to familiar schools and support networks, who end up in overcrowded classrooms in under-resourced districts. Thornfield's voice grew heavy with emotion. She showed me that our successful housing projects were directly contributing to problems that affect thousands of children. "What did you tell her?" "I told her I needed time to think about our conversation, but that I was committed to finding better approaches." Thornfield stood up and walked back to the windows. "Marcus, that meeting happened the day before Tommy and Jake had their dreams about the park and the rescue. The day before our paths crossed in a way that brought you into my life at exactly the moment when I needed to understand how to turn business success into community benefit." Marcus was beginning to see the pattern that Thornfield was describing, the way seemingly unrelated events had aligned to create opportunities for meaningful change. "There's something else," Thornfield continued. "Dr. Manning specializes in research about housing policy and community development. She's been studying successful models of workforce housing in other cities, documenting approaches that balance developer profits with community needs. You want me to work with her on the pilot project. I want you to learn from her research while she learns from your lived experience. Together, you could develop something that's both academically sound and practically effective." Marcus thought about the conversation he just had with Thornfield's leadership team, the mix of skepticism and genuine interest they'd shown toward community-focused development. "Richard, are you sure your executives are ready for this kind of change?" Morrison and Chen seemed pretty resistant to anything that might reduce profit margins. "They're good people who've been trained to think in terms of quarterly returns and shareholder expectations," Thornfield replied. "But they've never been asked to consider longer-term community benefits or the social costs of business decisions that seem profitable in the short term." Thornfield returned to his seat, leaning forward with the intensity Marcus had seen during their first hospital conversation. "Marcus, I've been thinking about something you said that day. about how revolutionary change happens when you're chosen for something larger than yourself. I was talking about jumping into the river to save your sons. And I'm talking about what happened afterward. The job offer, the community development opportunity, the chance to transform how a major corporation thinks about its responsibilities. Thornfield's eyes were bright with possibility. What if your rescue of Tommy and Jake was just the beginning? What if the real purpose was to bring together people who could create systemic change? Marcus considered the suggestion, thinking about all the families facing housing insecurity, all the children whose education was disrupted by displacement, all the communities where working people couldn't afford to live near their jobs. Richard, if we're going to do this, we need to be prepared for serious resistance. Not just from your executives, but from other developers, from investors who expect maximum returns, from city officials who are used to approving projects based on tax revenue rather than community benefit. What kind of resistance? The kind that goes beyond skeptical questions in conference rooms, Marcus said grimly. I've seen how powerful interests respond when someone challenges profitable systems. They don't just argue against new approaches. They work to discredit the people promoting change. Thornfield was quiet for a long moment, apparently processing the implications of what Marcus was describing. Are you saying that community-focused development could make us enemies? I'm saying that if we succeed, if we demonstrate that profitable development can serve working families instead of just luxury markets, we'll be threatening business models that generate billions of dollars for people who won't give up that revenue without a fight. Through the conference room windows, Marcus could see construction cranes dotting the skyline, evidence of the ongoing development boom that was transforming Seattle into a city where tech workers and executives could afford luxury housing, while teachers and nurses and mechanics were pushed farther from their jobs. Marcus, are you having second thoughts about the position? No, Marcus said without hesitation, but I want to make sure you understand what we're committing to. This isn't just about building different kinds of housing. We're talking about challenging fundamental assumptions about how development works, who it serves, what success looks like. Thornfield smiled with the expression of someone who had found exactly what he'd been searching for. Marcus, I didn't offer you this job because I wanted someone to manage a small corporate charity program. I offered it because I needed someone who understood what it means to fight for something important, even when the odds seem impossible. Like jumping into a freezing river to save two kids you've never met. Like spending months searching for work while facing a custody battle, never giving up on your daughter despite circumstances that would have broken most people. Thornfield's voice carried deep respect. You've already proven you can succeed against overwhelming odds. Now I'm asking you to help me understand how to use corporate resources to level the playing field for other families facing similar challenges. Marcus felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders, but also the kind of purposeful energy he hadn't experienced since his construction days. This was work that mattered, work that could transform lives beyond his own. All right, Marcus said. Let's build something that actually serves the community, but we do it right. Comprehensive research, sustainable financing, genuine partnerships with the people who will be affected by our decisions. Agreed. Where do we start? Marcus thought about Sofia, about the social workers' skeptical questions, about all the families living in inadequate housing while luxury developments stood half-empty. We start by listening to the people who need workforce housing, not surveys or focus groups, but actual conversations with families who are struggling with housing costs. How do we arrange those conversations? We go to the places where those families are. Community centers, public libraries, schools where parents are picking up their kids. We ask questions and we listen to answers, and we don't try to sell anything or promote any agenda. Thornfield was taking notes, his corporate executive mindset adapting to community organizing principles. How long do you think this research phase should take? As long as it takes to understand the real scope of housing challenges in this city, Marcus replied. We're not trying to meet a development timeline. We're trying to create solutions that actually work. As they wrapped up their conversation, Marcus realized that the job Thornfield was offering had already expanded beyond anything described in their initial discussions. He wasn't just joining a company. He was helping to redefine what corporate success could mean. The elevator ride down to the lobby gave Marcus time to process everything that had happened. 3 weeks ago, he'd been a desperate single father facing the loss of his daughter. Now he was designing initiatives that could affect thousands of families while serving as a senior executive for one of the region's most influential companies. Sophia was waiting in the lobby with Catherine Walsh, her new winter coat draped over a child-sized office chair while she worked on what appeared to be architectural drawings. "Daddy, look what I designed!" Sophia held up her sketches, which showed a residential complex with playground equipment, garden spaces, and what looked like a small library. "Mrs. Catherine told me about your new job, and I wanted to help design houses where kids like me could live." Marcus studied his daughter's drawings, seeing the thoughtful details she'd included. Covered areas where children could play during rainy weather, garden plots where families could grow vegetables, common spaces designed for community interaction rather than just individual privacy. "These are beautiful, Misha. Did you think of all these ideas yourself? Mrs. Catherine showed me pictures of different kinds of housing projects, and I picked the things that would make me feel safe and happy if we lived there." Catherine Walsh smiled as she gathered Sophia's art supplies. "Your daughter has remarkable insight into community design principles, Mr. Rivera. Her drawings incorporate concepts that urban planners spend years learning to balance." As they prepared to leave the Thornfield Industries building, Marcus felt his phone vibrating with an incoming call. The number was unfamiliar, but something about the timing made him answer, despite his usual caution about unknown callers. "Marcus Rivera? Mr. Rivera, this is Detective Linda Morrison with Seattle Police Department. I need to speak with you about an incident involving threats against your family." Marcus felt his stomach drop, his protective instincts immediately alert. "What kind of threats?" "Someone called Child Protective Services this morning claiming that you're exposing your daughter to dangerous conditions in connection with your new employment. The caller provided detailed information about your living situation and suggested that Sophia should be removed from your care immediately." Marcus looked at Sophia, who was still admiring her architectural drawings, unaware that someone was trying to use her as a weapon against her father. "Detective Morrison, do you know who made the call?" "The call was made from a burner phone, but we're investigating the source." "Mr. Rivera, has anyone expressed concerns about your relationship with Richard Thornfield or your position at Thornfield Industries?" Marcus thought about the resistance he'd sensed from Morrison and Chen during the morning's meeting, but corporate skepticism was very different from threats against his child. "Detective, I think this might be connected to my new job responsibilities, but I can't imagine anyone targeting Sophia because of corporate development projects." "Mr. Rivera, we've seen cases where business disputes escalate into personal harassment. I'd like to meet with you this week to discuss security precautions and document any additional threats you might receive." As Marcus ended the call, he realized that Thornfield's warnings about resistance to community-focused development might have been understated. Someone was already trying to undermine his ability to pursue housing initiatives that threatened existing profit models. But looking at Sophia's drawings, seeing her excitement about designing communities where children could thrive, Marcus felt his resolve strengthening. Whoever was targeting his family had made a serious miscalculation. They'd threatened the one thing that mattered more to him than his own safety, and that transformed his commitment to community development from professional responsibility into personal mission. The battle for housing justice in Seattle was apparently going to be more intense than he'd anticipated, but Marcus had already proven he was willing to risk everything to protect children who needed his help. Now he was going to prove that some fights are worth whatever cost they might demand. 6 months later, Marcus stood in the community center of South Seattle's Beacon Hill neighborhood, surrounded by 47 families whose lives had been turned upside down by development projects they'd never been consulted about. The meeting had been scheduled for 50 people, but word had spread through the community that someone was finally listening to their concerns about housing displacement, and the room was packed beyond capacity. Dr. Elizabeth Manning sat beside Marcus at a folding table that served as their makeshift headquarters, her laptop open to a presentation that would never be given because the families gathered here needed to talk more than they needed to listen to academic research. Instead, Marcus and Dr. Manning had spent the past 3 hours hearing stories that painted a devastating picture of how luxury development was systematically destroying working-class communities. Maria Santos, a hospital custodian whose family had lived in the neighborhood for 12 years, held her 6-year-old son's hand as she described receiving an eviction notice disguised as a lease non-renewal. They said the building was being sold for redevelopment, luxury condos starting at $4,000 a month. "Where am I supposed to find $4,000? I make $18 an hour cleaning up after people who probably spend more than that on lunch. James Patterson, a bus driver whose commute to work had doubled when his family was forced to move to cheaper housing in Tacoma, struggled with his English as he explained how displacement had affected his children's education. My daughter, she was doing good in school here, had friends, teachers who knew her. Now she's in different school, bigger classes, and she's angry all the time because nothing feels safe anymore. Story after story, each one representing a family that had been treated as collateral damage in someone else's vision of urban improvement. Marcus took notes on everything, not because he needed documentation for official reports, but because he wanted to remember every detail when he returned to Thornfield Industries' executive conference room to explain why their pilot housing project wasn't just business opportunity but moral imperative. Sofia sat in a corner of the room, her sketchbook open as she drew pictures of the children she'd met throughout the evening. She'd insisted on attending these community meetings, despite Marcus's concerns about exposing her to the housing crisis discussions that sometimes grew heated. But Sofia had proven to be remarkably effective at helping other children feel comfortable talking about their experiences with housing instability. Mr. Rivera called out David Kim, a restaurant worker whose English was heavily accented but perfectly clear. My neighbor told me you work for a big development company. Why should we trust you not to make same problems for us that other developers made? The question Marcus had been expecting finally arrived, and he appreciated Kim's directness. Trust had to be earned, especially from communities that had been repeatedly promised consultation and partnership by developers who ultimately prioritized profit over people. Mr. Kim, you shouldn't trust me based on anything I say tonight, Marcus replied. You should judge me by what I do over the coming months, whether I follow through on commitments, whether the housing project we're developing actually serves families like yours. Dr. Manning leaned forward, her academic training evident in how she framed the community's legitimate skepticism. David raises an important point about accountability. We're proposing to document this entire development process, including community input sessions, decision-making criteria, and outcome measurements, so everyone can evaluate whether we're meeting our stated goals. An elderly woman named Ruth Williams, whose fixed income had been stretched to the breaking point by rising rents, raised her hand tentatively. What kind of housing are you planning to build? Because I've heard affordable housing before, and it usually means affordable for people who make more money than anyone in this room. Marcus had prepared for this question by researching the actual income levels of families in the Beacon Hill area, and the numbers were sobering. Mrs. Williams, we're designing housing for people who make between $30,000 and $60,000 annually. That includes teachers, bus drivers, hospital workers, retail employees, and many others whose jobs are essential but don't pay enough to afford market-rate housing. How much would rent be? Asked Patricia Lopez, a single mother who worked 2 part-time jobs and still struggled to cover her current housing costs. We're targeting rent levels at 25% of income for families making $40,000 a year, Marcus replied. So approximately $800 monthly for a 2-bedroom unit, including utilities. The room erupted in surprised murmurs. Most of the families were paying significantly more than that for substandard housing, and the idea of quality apartments at genuinely affordable rents seemed too good to believe. What's the catch? Asked Tom Bradley, a construction worker whose skepticism was evident in his tone. No developer builds housing that cheap unless there's government money involved, and government money always comes with strings attached. Dr. Manning opened her laptop to show financial projections that Marcus had spent weeks developing with Thornfield's accounting team. Tom, you're right that traditional luxury development models couldn't support these rent levels, but we're using a different approach that prioritizes long-term stability over short-term profits. She explained how the pilot project would work with financing structures that emphasize community benefits rather than maximum returns for investors. Lower profit margins offset by reduced marketing costs, longer-term tenant stability, and partnerships with local employers who could provide down payment assistance or rental guarantees for their workers. Marcus watched the faces around the room, seeing cautious hope mixed with the kind of wariness that comes from repeated disappointment. These families had been promised community involvement in development decisions before, only to watch luxury projects rise on land where their neighbors once lived. Mrs. Lopez, Mr. Kim, All of you, Marcus said, standing up to address the room directly. I understand your skepticism because I lived through housing insecurity myself. 6 months ago, my daughter and I were facing eviction, and I was unemployed with a custody hearing that could have separated us permanently. He gestured toward Sofia, who looked up from her drawings to wave at the assembled families. Sofia and I lived in the kind of housing many of you are stuck with right now. Overpriced, poorly maintained, with landlords who treat tenants as disposable. I'm not approaching this project as an abstract business opportunity. I'm working on it because I know what it feels like to choose between rent money and groceries. The energy in the room shifted perceptibly, the formal distance between presenter and audience dissolving into something more like conversation between neighbors facing similar challenges. Mr. Rivera, said Maria Santos, if you build this housing, how do we know it won't just get bought out by some other company in a few years and turned into luxury apartments? Dr. Manning fielded this question, explaining the legal structures they were developing to protect affordability in perpetuity, community land trusts, deed restrictions, and resident ownership opportunities that would prevent future speculation and ensure long-term affordability. But more importantly, Marcus added, you'll be involved in governance decisions about the property. Not just tenant advisory committees that developers ignore, but actual voting power over major decisions that affect your housing security. As the evening progressed, the conversation evolved from skeptical questioning toward collaborative problem-solving. Families shared insights about community needs that Marcus and Dr. Manning had never considered, from the importance of covered parking for workers who couldn't afford car repairs, to childcare facilities that could accommodate the irregular schedules of service industry employees. Sofia approached the front of the room during a break in the discussion, carrying her sketchbook and wearing the serious expression she used when she had something important to communicate. Can I show everyone my drawings? She asked Marcus quietly. Marcus nodded, and Sofia opened her sketchbook to reveal detailed illustrations of housing complexes that incorporated suggestions she'd heard throughout the evening. Community gardens where families could grow vegetables, covered play areas for children, laundry facilities with childcare space where parents could supervise their kids while washing clothes. I drew these because I wanted to remember all the good ideas, Sofia explained to the room. My daddy says that good ideas only work if you actually use them, so I wanted to make sure we don't forget anything important. Ruth Williams studied Sofia's drawings with the attention she might give to professional architectural plans. Honey, you included everything we talked about tonight. The covered bus stop so people don't get soaked waiting for transit, the community room with kitchen facilities for family celebrations, even the tool library where neighbors can borrow equipment instead of having to buy everything. Patricia Lopez leaned over to examine the drawings more closely. Sofia, these look like places where families could actually build community instead of just existing side by side. When developers show us their plans, they never include spaces for people to get to know each other. As the meeting wound down, families began signing up for follow-up sessions where they could provide input on specific design elements and community programming. Marcus felt cautiously optimistic about the response, but also aware that community engagement was just the beginning of what promised to be a complex and challenging development process. Dr. Manning was packing up her laptop when David Kim approached with a question that had clearly been weighing on his mind. Professor, you said you're documenting this process for research. What happens to that research? Who gets to use it? David, that's an excellent question, Dr. Manning replied. The research will be published in academic journals and policy reports, but more importantly, it will be available to community organizations and other developers who want to learn from our successes and failures. So if this works, other neighborhoods could use the same approach. That's exactly what we're hoping, Marcus said. If we can prove that community-focused development is both profitable and effective, it becomes a model that could be replicated throughout the region. As families began gathering their children and preparing to leave, Marcus noticed a black sedan parked across the street from the community center. The same type of vehicle that had been appearing near Sofia's school and their apartment building over the past several weeks. Detective Morrison had warned him to watch for surveillance, and tonight's community meeting had apparently attracted unwanted attention. Sofia was saying goodbye to the children she'd met, exchanging contact information with the confidence of someone who expected to see her new friends again soon. Marcus admired her ability to form connections quickly, but he was also increasingly concerned about the safety implications of their public role in housing advocacy. Daddy, can we invite some of these families to see our pilot project when it gets built? Sofia asked as they walked toward their car. Absolutely, Misha. In fact, some of these families might end up living in the pilot project if everything works out the way we're planning. As they drove home through neighborhoods where for sale signs had multiplied like flowers after rain, Marcus reflected on how much their lives had changed since the river rescue. The job at Thornfield Industries had provided financial security and professional purpose, but it had also drawn them into conflicts they'd never anticipated. His phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Your housing project threatens legitimate business interests. Withdraw your proposal or face consequences that extend beyond professional retaliation. Marcus deleted the message without showing it to Sofia, but he couldn't shake the feeling that tonight's community meeting had escalated their situation in ways he was only beginning to understand. Someone with significant resources was working actively to prevent workforce housing development, and they'd made it clear that Marcus's family was considered fair game in their campaign to protect luxury development profits. The next morning brought a confrontation that Marcus had been dreading, but knew was inevitable. Richard Thornfield called an emergency board meeting to present the pilot project proposal, and the Thornfield Industries conference room was packed with people whose body language suggested anything but enthusiasm for community-focused development. Marcus sat beside Dr. Manning at one end of the polished table, their research materials and community input documentation spread before them like evidence in a trial. At the other end, Janet Morrison presided over a group of board members and senior executives whose expensive suits and skeptical expressions made clear their priorities. Ladies and gentlemen, Thornfield began. Over the past 6 months, Marcus Rivera and Dr. Manning have developed a comprehensive proposal for workforce housing that could transform how our company approaches residential development. Board member Harold Westfield, whose investment portfolio included substantial holdings in luxury development projects, interrupted before Thornfield could continue. Richard, I appreciate your enthusiasm for corporate social responsibility initiatives, but we have fiduciary obligations to shareholders that supersede experimental housing projects. Harold, this isn't experimental charity, Thornfield replied firmly. This is a sustainable business model that addresses market needs while generating reasonable returns. Dr. Manning activated her presentation, displaying financial projections that had taken months to develop. Mr. Westfield, our analysis indicates that community-focused development can achieve profit margins of 12 to 15% while providing housing for essential workers whose contributions support regional economic growth. Board member Patricia Sterling, whose family's construction company had built several luxury developments in Seattle, studied the financial data with obvious skepticism. Dr. Manning, those profit margins are significantly lower than industry standards for residential development. How do you justify reduced returns to investors who could achieve higher profits through conventional projects? Marcus had prepared for this question by researching the actual long-term costs of luxury-only development models. Ms. Sterling, conventional development generates higher short-term profits but creates social costs that ultimately affect business operations. When teachers and nurses and retail workers can't afford to live near their jobs, employers face higher turnover, longer commutes, and reduced productivity. That's a social policy argument, not a business justification. Westfield countered. Thornfield Industries can't solve regional housing problems at the expense of shareholder returns. Thornfield leaned forward with an intensity that Marcus had learned to recognize as his most persuasive mode. Harold, Pat, all of you, I want to share something that's been weighing on my mind since we began this process. The room fell silent as Thornfield stood up and walked to the windows overlooking the city. 6 months ago, my sons nearly drowned in the Thornfield River. They were saved by a man who risked his own life without hesitation, without knowing who they were or expecting any reward. Marcus felt uncomfortable being the focus of Thornfield's attention, but he understood that his employer was building toward a larger point about corporate responsibility and community investment. That rescue taught me something about the difference between managing risk and accepting responsibility, Thornfield continued. Marcus jumped into freezing water because children needed help, not because he'd calculated the probability of successful rescue versus personal injury. Richard, we appreciate the dramatic story, but corporate governance requires different decision-making criteria than emergency rescues, Sterling said impatiently. Does it, Pat? Because I've been thinking about what kind of company I want Tommy and Jake to inherit. What kind of community I want them to grow up in. Thornfield's voice carried an emotional weight, that seemed to surprise even his closest business associates. If we spend the next 20 years maximizing profits while teachers and firefighters get priced out of the communities they serve, what legacy are we creating? Dr. Manning seized the opening to present community input data that Marcus had gathered through dozens of neighborhood meetings. Board members, we're not asking you to choose between profitability and social responsibility. We're demonstrating that long-term business success depends on healthy communities where working families can afford stable housing. She displayed photographs and testimonials from the Beacon Hill meeting, putting human faces on the housing crisis that board members might otherwise consider as abstract policy issues. Maria Santos describing her fear of displacement, James Patterson explaining how his children's education had been disrupted by forced relocation, Ruth Williams calculating the percentage of her fixed income consumed by rising rents. These aren't statistics, Marcus said, standing up to address the board directly. These are your employees, your customers, the people whose work makes this company possible. When they can't afford housing near their jobs, your business operations suffer along with their families. Westfield shuffled through his papers with obvious irritation. Mr. Rivera, emotional appeals don't change mathematical realities. Reduced profit margins mean less capital available for expansion, fewer jobs created, lower returns for pension funds that depend on our dividend payments. Mr. Westfield, what if those mathematical realities change when you factor in the full costs of housing instability? Marcus replied, employee turnover, recruitment expenses, productivity losses from long commutes, emergency service costs in communities where people are housed inappropriately. Dr. Manning presented research data comparing regions with balanced housing markets to areas dominated by luxury development. Harold, communities with workforce housing options demonstrate higher economic mobility, better educational outcomes, and lower social service costs. Those benefits translate into business advantages for companies operating in those markets. The debate continued for another hour, ranging across topics from construction costs to zoning regulations to financing mechanisms. Marcus found himself defending community-focused development against objections that seemed designed more to protect existing profit models than to evaluate innovative approaches. Finally, Thornfield called for a preliminary vote on whether to authorize a feasibility study for the pilot project. The results were closer than Marcus had expected. 4 board members in favor, 3 opposed, with 2 abstentions pending additional financial analysis. We'll reconvene in 2 weeks for a final decision, Thornfield announced. I want detailed projections for construction costs, market analysis for workforce housing demand, and legal review of affordability protection mechanisms. As the meeting concluded, Marcus gathered his materials while trying to assess whether the partial approval represented progress or simply postponement of inevitable rejection. The board members who had voted against the feasibility study made their opposition clear through body language and whispered conversations that suggested coordinated resistance. Dr. Manning was more optimistic as they walked toward the elevators. Marcus, getting this far with a major corporation is actually remarkable progress. Most developers would never have allowed community input to influence board-level decisions. But will it be enough? Marcus asked. I saw how Westfield and Sterling were looking at the financial projections. They're not convinced that community benefits justify reduced profit margins. That's why the next 2 weeks are crucial, Dr. Manning replied. We need to demonstrate that workforce housing isn't just socially responsible but financially advantageous in ways they haven't considered. As they reached the lobby, Marcus noticed the same black sedan that had been parked outside the community center was now positioned across the street from Thornfield Industries headquarters. Someone was definitely monitoring their activities, and the surveillance was becoming more obvious and more frequent. His phone buzzed with another anonymous text message. Board meeting went well? Your housing project is dead. Walk away while you still can. Marcus showed the message to Dr. Manning, who frowned with concern. Marcus, have you reported these threats to Detective Morrison? I've been documenting everything, but the messages are untraceable and no specific crimes have been committed. The police can't do much unless the threats become more explicit. Maybe it's time to consider whether this project is worth the personal risk, Dr. Manning suggested gently. You have Sofia to think about, and there are other ways to address housing issues that might not make you such a visible target. Marcus thought about the families he'd met at community meetings, about Sofia's drawings of housing complexes designed around community needs rather than profit maximization. The threats were escalating, but so was the potential impact of successful workforce housing development. "Dr. Manning, I've been thinking about something," Thornfield said during the board meeting. "About the difference between managing risk and accepting responsibility." Marcus looked toward the building where he'd just spent hours defending community-focused development against people who saw it as a threat to their financial interests. Maybe some responsibilities are worth whatever risks they might involve. As they parted ways in the parking garage, Marcus realized that the next 2 weeks would determine not just the fate of the pilot housing project, but the direction of his family's future. The surveillance, the threats, the corporate resistance, all suggested that someone with significant resources was working systematically to prevent workforce housing development. But Marcus had already proven he was willing to risk everything to protect children who needed his help. Now he was going to prove that some fights are worth whatever cost they might demand, especially when the alternative is abandoning communities that had placed their trust in his promise to create something better. The black sedan followed him home that evening, maintaining careful distance but making no effort to hide its presence. Marcus made note of the license plate and driving patterns, adding details to the documentation he'd been keeping for Detective Morrison. Sofia was waiting in their apartment with homework spread across the kitchen table, her latest architectural drawings incorporated into a school project about community planning. She looked up as Marcus entered, her expression brightening with a smile that made every challenge worthwhile. "Daddy, how did your big meeting go today?" "It was complicated, Mija, but we're moving forward with the housing project." "Good," Sofia said, with the firm conviction that Marcus had learned to trust. "Because the families we met need better places to live, and somebody has to help them." Looking at his daughter's drawings, at her absolute faith that adults could solve problems when they worked together, Marcus felt his commitment to the pilot project solidifying into something unshakable. The threats and surveillance and corporate resistance were real, but so was the opportunity to demonstrate that business success could serve community needs instead of undermining them. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new resistance, new attempts to derail workforce housing development. But tonight, Marcus Rivera sat with his daughter in their modest apartment, planning a future where no family would have to choose between affordable housing and community stability. The river rescue that had brought him together with Richard Thornfield had been just the beginning. The real rescue was still underway, and its success would be measured not in quarterly profits, but in families who could afford stable housing in communities where their children could thrive. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.